All right, welcome to week 3 of Greater. Week 3 is all about being greater in your marriage. In fact, this week and the next 3 weeks are going to take the gospel and apply it to a very specific context in your lives. Your marriage, your relationship with your kids, your workplace, and then just generally living life in the world. Now, I don't care who you are, if you're married, you can probably be greater in your marriage. I mean, even the people who have the best marriages, there's always ways to get better. And if you're not married, but you want to be married someday, then this is going to be a helpful discussion for you because it's going to show you what a godly wife looks like, and it's going to show you what a godly husband looks like. And so it'll kind of help you discover what kind of man am I looking for, or what kind of person should I become. And so I hope you're helped by this discussion. And then single people, you may think this is irrelevant for me, but it's really not. When God would write encouragement to married couples, he would always do so to the whole community of people, even the single people, because he wanted them to know what to look for, what to praise, what to promote, what to pray for. And so this discussion will be helpful for you as well, no matter what season of life you find yourself in. I remember when I first got married, I read all the books on marriage. I was in seminary at the time. I was dating Audra. I wanted to be like the best husband ever. And so I did the same thing with parenting, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced. Because when I entered into marriage, it was not anything like what I expected. It's the difference between reading something on paper and living something in real life. And people are complicated and nuanced and messy. And marriage can get that way. Even if you know the right answers, it's not always easy to do the right thing, the right time, the right way, every time. And so, I remember a couple of years ago talking with Audra, and she said something to the effect of, I like that you keep a part of yourself that's only for me. You know, it's not, you don't do it in the pulpit. I think I'd said something that I probably would have never said in the pulpit. Not like I cussed or anything like that, but something kind of cutesy or funny. And I was thinking just the other day, yeah, there are things that I probably keep that are for Audra alone, that are funny and that are kind of, that she likes to see and I like to see. But there's other parts of myself that are only for Audra that are not so great. And that's true of your marriage as well. Because when you're married to someone, you see them warts and all. You don't just see them naked physically. You see them naked emotionally and spiritually in every other way. And sometimes we see things about ourselves that we don't like. And we see things about the other person that we don't love. That's why, as Pastor David likes to say, marriage is like God's heavenly sandpaper. Because it, more than anything else, rubs out the rough edges of your character, and it'll expose things in you that need to be exposed. And so marriage, more than anything else, can be used by the Lord to make you the kind of man or woman he wants you to be. And he'll create that man or woman by helping you become the kind of husband or wife you are meant to be. So that's what we're going to discuss today. Before we do that, though, kind of icebreaker, because the discussion may get kind of heavy today, I just want you to talk about what were your expectations going into marriage, and what happened after you got married to those expectations. What did you see coming? What did you not see coming? Or if you're single, what do you think is an ideal marriage? And just have a kind of lighthearted conversation about it. You married people can show the single people what they have to look forward to, and vice versa. And then we'll get to the instruction that Paul gives to wives, and then we'll get to the instruction he has for husbands. All right, have a good discussion, and I'll see you after that. We're going to have teaching that's geared towards wives and husbands. And I don't know if this is the best way to do it, but what I want to do is break it down, wives first and then husbands. So I'm going to read the passage that Paul gives encouragement to to wives first. And then after that, we'll have a discussion, and then we'll move to the husbands. When it comes to wives, here's what Paul says in Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 18. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now, I know when you hear a word like submit, there's probably not a more offensive word, at least for some people in our culture today. And so to kind of fill out some of the teaching on of what God encourages wives to be like, I want to read what Paul says in Ephesians. Ephesians is a sister book to Colossians, and the last section of Ephesians has almost an identical set of encouragement and counsel that Paul does in Colossians. And it really kind of gives you a fuller picture. So here's what he says to wives in Ephesians chapter 6. Remember, same author, same kind of general counsel, same way of thinking. But this is what he says to wives in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 22. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. And so again, I know that the word submission is kind of offensive, and I think it's helpful for us to remember that when it comes to the gospel, period, it offends every culture at some level or another. For conservative cultures, it's offensive because it's kind of liberating and kind of a great equalizer in many respects, and that makes people nervous. Even countries like China or North Korea, that's why they shut Christianity down. But for liberal cultures, the gospel is offensive because it threatens individual autonomy and that individualistic spirit that a lot of Westerners carry. And so we know right up front that the gospel can kind of be insulting and offensive, but it doesn't need to be needlessly so. So what I wanted to do with this word to submit is to kind of talk about what it is and what it isn't, because I've heard a lot of teaching on this issue that I think is just incorrect. And so from my vantage point, this is what I think submission is, and this is what submission is not. Submission is not a command given to the husband to force the wife to do. The submission is a decision made by the wife herself. So it's not a demand on the husband to get his wife in line and do so by being a jerk. It's a voluntary decision made by the wife. I would also say submission is not a type of slavery. It doesn't mean that the wife is trapped to do the bidding of her husband, or she's kind of like the hired hand of the husband to do whatever the husband wants. If you read passages like Proverbs 31, you see that that ideal wife is actually really independent and free to do quite whatever she wants, so long as it furthers the kingdom of God and furthers the agenda of her family. So submission isn't slavery, and submission isn't silence. Some people think about submission, well, just women need to get over there and submit, kind of keep their mouths shut. And that's not what submission is. If you think about it, women are more gifted in certain areas than men are, and certain women are certainly more gifted in certain respects than their husbands, and so they have something to bring to the table, and that something should be heard and listened to. And so submission doesn't necessarily mean silence. To silence a woman just because she's a woman is not only unbiblical, it's actually kind of foolish and unwise. So it's not slavery, it's not silence, and I think the heart of submission is it's about subordination, not about superiority. To say that women are to submit doesn't mean men are somehow superior. Men and women are both created in the image of God, equally so, equally valuable. But it's a subordination in that a wife willingly puts herself under as the Bible puts it, the headship or the spiritual authority or responsibility of her husband. And the best way, I think, to understand this is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 3. And he uses headship language. And we don't use this language much anymore, but I think it's more helpful than the word leadership because it kind of gets at the idea a little better. He says in 1 Corinthians 13:3, I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God, our God the Father. So if you think about the Trinity, even in the Trinity there is submission. And obviously that doesn't mean that God the Father is somehow more God than God the Son. They're equally God, they're equally capable, they're equally valuable, they're equal in all those ways. Yet for the purpose of salvation, to accomplish the redemptive plan, to bring about the kingdom, there had to be an order to that relationship. And therefore, God the Son willingly submitted himself to God the Father. Sometimes you'll hear people put it in terms of the Father plans, the Son accomplishes, and the Spirit applies. That's subordination, that's submission. God the Son willingly submitted himself to God the Father. And that's the same kind of idea that's taking place in marriage. In marriage, the wife plays a subordinate role, puts herself under the husband in a respect, not because she's less valuable or less important or even less capable, but just because every relationship has a certain function, or every unit has a certain function, and for the family unit, God has designed it to function in that way. The way I like to think about it in terms of my own marriage, the way sometimes I'll explain it with Audra, is that submission is in terms of headship. Headship is in terms of who takes responsibility for the family. Your husband, if you're a wife, is the one who is accountable to God for your family. He takes responsibility. You hear people say the buck has to stop somewhere. Well, in God's economy, the buck stops with the husband. He's the spiritual head of the family. He takes responsibility for it. And so what it looks like is wives leveraging their gifts and using what God has given them, their talents and abilities, doing whatever God has given them to do, but doing so in a way that furthers the agenda of the kingdom of God and subordinates themselves in such a way that they're relating with their husband with the knowledge that he's the one who's responsible to God for the care of the family. And what that looks like on a practical basis can be, who knows? It's very varied. Some women are more natural leaders than their husband. So they may practice a leadership role in their family, even though their husband doesn't, while still respecting the headship of that husband. So leadership and headship are not the same thing. Leadership is about a personality or a gifting. Headship is more about responsibility and an office or a responsibility and authority. And so you may, as a woman, be a more natural leader than your husband, and you should be free to lead while honoring the headship of your husband. That's what submission looks like. It's a voluntary decision made by the wife on an ongoing basis to subordinate herself to the spiritual headship of her husband. Last thing I'd say is submission is fitting in the Lord, or in Paul's way of saying it in Ephesians, it's as to the Lord. And so I'd say submission never violates your conscience. You should never let your husband lead you into sin. It's something you do in spite of your husband, not because of your husband. You don't submit because he's worthy of it. You submit because the Lord is worthy, and that's what he's called you, or the role he's called you to play in your marriage. And then you never let your husband lead you into something that's clearly against the will of God. That's why I think it's important that husbands and wives understand submission doesn't mean the wife has no role to play in leadership decisions or any kind of decisions. Husbands, your wives are better than you at some things. They have wisdom and counsel to bring to bear that should be heard and listened to. And so at minimum, wives, if you feel like your husband's leading in a direction that is not the will of God, at minimum, you should make that known. At best, the husband should be able to listen to that and receive it and make decisions together, all the while knowing that the man is the one who's the head of the family, who takes responsibility for what ends up happening. So that's what I think submission is, and you'll have a discussion about it in your own group, kind of how you think about it and maybe the way you wrestle with it and come to terms with it. But I wanted to spend most of our time thinking practically, what does that look like in the home? Because it's one thing to say, wives, submit to your husbands. It's another thing to ask, what does that actually mean at a practical level? And so I just listed a few things. I listed 7 things. First, make the house a home. Make your house a place that your husband wants to be. Make it a safe place and a place of encouragement. Not a palace to show off, but a home in which to live. Number 2, use your words to build up instead of tear down. I don't know why, but men are seemingly especially sensitive to words. And women can, or girls at least, can sometimes be incredibly mean with their words. And so use your words to build up instead of tear down. Number 3, show an interest in his problems and concerns. Your husband's going to derive a lot of his identity from his work and his job. And so take an interest in that. Help him solve problems that he's facing. He'd probably love that. And that's one of the ways that you can honor him as the spiritual head of the home or the authority in the life. You're taking an interest in what he's facing and what he's processing. So show an interest in those things. Number 4, remind him that you're on his team. It's encouraging for men to remember that they're not in it all by themselves. They don't have to make decisions all alone. That you're there to compliment him and to help him as a player on his team. Number 5 is just live a spirit-filled life. Submission is a spirit-filled exercise. It comes as a result of being filled with the Spirit. It's coming right off of the heels of Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 to 17. And Ephesians is coming right off the heels of Ephesians 5, talking about the spirit-filled life. And so if you'll live a spirit-filled life as a wife, you'll be more likely to to start winning in the way that you relate with your husband. Things like patience, kindness, love, forbearance, long-suffering, all the things we talked about last week. Make those holy habits in your life, and you're more likely to be successful or greater in your marriage. Lastly, build yourself up spiritually, physically, and emotionally. Remember, your husband has the responsibility for your spiritual growth. You're accountable to God for your own sins, obviously, but he's accountable to God for helping you flourish as his wife. And so you take initiative and kind of help him or bring him in on that, or just build yourself up. Maybe it means buying a new dress, going to the gym. Could mean reading a book or starting a Bible study and letting him in on that, and even inviting his support and interaction with you as you develop yourself spiritually and other different kinds of ways. Then the last thing I'd say is to show confidence in him and his decisions. Any man who walks with the knowledge that he's the head of his home, he carries that as a heavy responsibility. And any way that you can support him or show confidence in him is going to elevate his success. And it's one of the ways you can be greater in your marriage as a wife. Even if you can't support his decisions, and there'll maybe come a time when you can't, and submission is maybe going to be very difficult. Even if you can't support his decision, at least try to find a way to support him as a person and your faith in him. In all of those ways, you'll be practicing what Paul is saying here when it says, "Wives, be submissive to your husbands." So talk about that in your groups, then we're going to come back around and talk about husbands. And husbands have a little more things given to them. But talk about, what is submission to you? How do you process it in your own life? Is there some things that we discussed today that maybe shed new light on it, or things you agree with or disagree with? But spend a little time talking about submission, both men and women in the room, and then come back and we'll talk about God's counsel to husbands. All right, I know that maybe was an uncomfortable conversation in some respects, but I hope you had a good discussion and maybe shed new light on this. Submission doesn't have to be a dirty word or a bad word. It doesn't have to be a belittling word. Understood in a biblical way, I think it's liberating and really empowers you as a woman to serve your husband in a way that honors the Lord. Now we're going to look at what Paul has to say to husbands. In Colossians chapter 3, he says, "Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them." Love your wives and do not be harsh with them. And then in Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 25, he says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she may be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we're members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery of marriage is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." Now, if I put myself in the shoes of a woman and I heard, "Wives, submit to your husbands," and "Husbands, love your wives," I'd be like, that's a ripoff. Husbands get the easy job, love, and we have this hard thing to do, submit. And some of that is because we don't properly understand the word submit. Some of it's because we have a watered down definition of love. And that's one of the reasons I read the Ephesians passage, because it clarifies what the kind of love Paul's actually encouraging. And it's not just a sentimental love, or love is a feeling, but love is a choice that is modeling or displaying towards your wife the same kind of character and sacrifice that Jesus himself displayed towards you and me as his church. And so how did Jesus love the church? Well, it was selfless and sacrificial. It was selfless and service-oriented. It wasn't just a feeling. It wasn't just kind of an emotion. He acted out the love that he had for the church. And it was always furthering the agenda of somebody else, not his own. He was esteeming the interest of others ahead of his own. And so his love was service-oriented and selfless. It was sacrificial. Love without sacrifice isn't much. It's just sentimentality. Love should cost you something. It certainly cost the Lord something. He sacrificed not only his ultimate sacrifice of his life, but also his time and his energy. He sacrificed his reputation in some ways. He sacrificed convenience. All of those things are demonstrations of love. His love was unconditional, which Romans 5, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So it didn't matter if we were worthy of the love or if we were going to love him back in response. His love was unconditional. So as a husband, this means your love should also be selfless and service-oriented. It's not just in words only. You're actually showing deeds towards your wife, lovingly serving her in practical, concrete ways. It means that it's a sacrificial love. It costs you your own time and money and resources, maybe convenience or even reputation. Your love is unconditional, even when she doesn't love you back, even if she's not very lovely and or lovable. Your love is unconditional because the love of Christ towards the church was unconditional. And so this is putting a little bit of teeth on love so that it gets some hooks in our hearts and gives us a way to show it practically in our lives. The other things I'd say about Jesus' love is it was never ending, never failed, never gives up. It was always purposeful. It was to build up the church. It was to create them, make them into who they were made to be. It was to improve them, to make them better. And then it was always visible. It wasn't just with his words, it was with his life. And so I wrote down 10 ways that husbands can love their wives. I'm going to share these 10 ways, and I want you to talk about it as a group, some of the ways that you show love. And then wives, I think guys probably need a little bit of help of knowing how can I love you in such a way that it's received, that it's heard. Because some of the ways that husbands love their wives maybe is the way a husband would love himself, but it's not a way that's going to be received well by their wives. So number one, men, if you want to love your wife like Christ loved the church, then communicate your love with words. Actually say the words, I love you. Don't just say, I love you too. Responding, you be the one that comes out and says it first. Or not just that, but tell her how much you love her or cherish her, adore her. Use other languages or use other words besides the word love to express your love. Observe her attempts to serve you and compliment her. Show her gratitude with your words. Pray for her out loud, in public and in private. Let her hear you going before the throne of God on her behalf. Use your words to love your wife. And then something I wrote down, make a list of 365 things that you appreciate about your wife and communicate those with your words. So the first way you love your wife practically is with your words. The second way, and if you don't get this thing down, you won't get any of the rest of these down. This is something that's in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, and that is to understand your wife. One of the best ways you're going to love your wife well is when you understand her. 1 Peter 3:7 says that husbands should live with their wives in an understanding way, or literally according to knowledge. So you need to get a PhD in your MRS, as one of my mentors used to say. Know her better than you know anything else. Be a lifelong student of her, studying her, what makes her tick, what turns her off, what turns her on. Not just sexually, but physically, emotionally, socially, financially, every other which way. Understand your wife, which means, by the way, you've got to be present. Don't just be in the room, be with her in the room so that you are getting to know her. And then you also have to listen. Don't just ask her about her likes and dislikes. Ask her mom, ask her dad, ask her friends, ask people who know her in a way that you don't know her, and get that information and receive it into your mind and understand your wife. Because if you'll understand her, then you'll love her better than you do now. So do it with your words, understand her. The third way to love her practically is to meet her various needs, or to provide for her various needs. She has physical needs, you need to meet those. Financial needs, meet those. There are emotional needs, intellectual needs, social needs, recreational needs, sexual needs, spiritual needs. Meet all those needs. At a minimum, at least show your desire to want to meet those needs. but she has needs, and one of the ways you love her is by meeting those needs. And there's a ton of literature on this. Most marriage books these days are written about meeting needs, getting your love language and speaking your love language, and all that stuff's great. It's not the only way to love your wife, but it's a great way, and a way that you should work on if you want to practically love her in a way that Christ loved the church. So provide for her needs, and then the fourth thing would be protect her from various threats. Don't just provide for her, but protect her. Paul says to love your wife like you love your own body. You protect your own body, not just physically, with a weapon, but protect her time, protect her energy level. Maybe she's doing too much, and you got to kind of protect her from herself and say, maybe we shouldn't do that many projects. Protect her emotionally. People may say things about her. She may think things about herself. If you hear those things or you see those kinds of things happening, then protect her. One of the ways that you'll love your wife is by protecting her from various threats. The next thing is assist her with various responsibilities. As one of the prophets once said, sex starts in the kitchen. And that's actually not in the Old Testament, but I think it's probably true. If you'll assist her with her various responsibilities, that's a practical demonstration of love. And it's not less manly, for you to do dishes or for you to do the laundry. It doesn't make you less manly. It makes you more manly, because that's the way God's called you to love your wife as a godly man. So assist her. The next thing is to remind her of her place. And I don't mean saying, check yourself before you wreck yourself. You better submit. That is not what I'm saying. Her place is number one in your life. And remind her of that. Remind her, you mean more to me than the kids. You mean more to me than any of my friends. You mean more to me than my job. You are number one in my life. Outside of my relationship with Christ, you're precious to me. You mean more to me than anything else. And it may mean that you have to ask her if she feels that way, and be ready for hearing something you may not want to hear. But if she doesn't feel like number one, then you're not loving her well. And so find ways to communicate that and remind her that she's number one in your life. The fifth thing or sixth thing is to honor her. Chivalry shouldn't die in your relationship. Treat her like a valuable jewel, not like a garbage can. That means watch your language. Don't use crude jokes. Don't ever cut her down or make her feel foolish, especially in front of other people. 1 Peter 3:7 says, honor your wife. Honor her. Treat her like a very precious, rare jewel that's extremely fragile and breakable, and not like a piece of garbage or a tool you can kind of use and throw around to do whatever you want with. Treat her in a delicate way. Honor her as your wife. Then 8, number 7 is to get over yourself. I actually got this from Audra. This is something we say in our marriage. If you want to love your wife well, then get over yourself. You say, well, I had a hard day at work, and somebody made fun of me, and I'm really tired, and you want to come home and veg out and turn on your Netflix and kind of, die to the world. Guess what? She had a hard day too, and the kids wore her out, and maybe she got some news she didn't want to hear. And so instead of coming home and turning inward and making it all about you, you sit down on the floor, you wrestle with the kids, you put them to bed, you go and ask her how her day was before you even open your mouth about how your day was, because she's number one. And that's how you serve her, is you get over yourself. And sometimes that's going to be after you've opened your mouth and said something you shouldn't have said, and you're going to want to maybe get into a fight. And instead of doing that, you say, I'm going to get over myself, because that's how I'm going to love my wife. The ninth thing is to share yourself. Most marriages don't end because of 1 or 2 fights. They end the death, a slow death of 1,000 cuts of indifference. So people drift apart slowly over time because they stop communicating with one another. They don't open themselves up to one another. And so share yourself. Let your wife in on what's going on in your world. How are you feeling? I know that sounds kind of very counselor-y, but it's the way to get intimacy back in your marriage. It's the way to love your wife, because she wants to know what's going on in your life. So share yourself, and that's a way that you can show love. And then the 10th thing is never, ever, 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 ever compare her unfavorably with another person. Ever. Ever. You may get encouragement from comparing yourself with a guy in the gym who benches more than you, or somebody who shoots better than you. But it is not helpful for you to compare your wife to another woman, or to compare her to any other person. It's not going to encourage her. It's going to make her think that maybe you want that person more than her. It's going to mess with her mind. Never, ever compare her. As Andy Stanley likes to say, there's no win in comparison. And so never put that on your wife, and you'll love her well. So with those things in mind, I want you to take questions 4 through 6 and talk about them. What comes to your mind when you hear the word love? Ladies, kind of help us out here. What is it? How can we love you in a practical way? Talk about some of those things that I mentioned. I mentioned 10 different practical, concrete ways you can show love to your spouse. Talk about that. And then there's a discussion in there about avoiding harshness. It's not just enough to present the positive demonstrations of love. You need to avoid the negatives. And so, things like speaking harshly or comparing your wife, those kinds of things are harsh. They're bitter. And so, I have a discussion around that. And then once you're done, we'll have one more question, and I'll pause your video and have that discussion, and then we'll come back for the last question. All right, I know you're probably thinking, we don't have any more time to have any more discussion, and I'm not going to say anything else but this. Knowing all this stuff about marriage and how to submit to your husband's wives, or husbands how to love your wives, that stuff is useless up here in your head. It's got to go out. It's got to be applied. You can't just hear the word. You've got to do the word. And so before you leave today, I want you to write down or kind of make a mental note, wives, what are 2 to 3 ways you can show a submissive spirit to your husband? And then husbands, list or write down 2 to 3 ways that you can show love to your wives. And do that before you leave. And then come back next week and share the practical, concrete ways that you demonstrated those things in your marriage, and talk about how God has made your marriage greater as a result. Hope you have a great week.